Hello, welcome to the Stump, where I discuss various forestry issues, career, personal development, and anything else on my mind. I'm your host, Matt Comiskey. Today, Ken Bevis is joining us on the Stump. Ken is a stewardship, fish, and wildlife biologist with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. And he's also well known in forestry and beyond for his musical and singing talents. So welcome, Ken. Glad you could join us. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Hello, Matt. Thanks for having me on here, and I appreciate your efforts to spread the good word in the forestry world.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think, it's you've got some pretty big shoes to fill there. So, you were added to my list of people to come interview pretty quickly. And then we had that uh, serendipitous run in the barbecue joint in Twisp, Washington, of all places. Now, of course, you live over in that vicinity, but I don't, obviously. I live on the west side. So that was kind of a unique opportunity there to run into you. But I just thought maybe we could get started with you could tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your career, and then we'll kind of dive into the work and maybe wrap up with the music and go from there.
That sounds good, Matt. Let's see. My name is Ken Bevis, and I am currently the stewardship fish and wildlife biologist for the Department of Natural Resources Service Forestry group. And so we have the Small Forest Landowner Office, and we have Service Forestry, and we have various programs to help small forest landowners do good management on their properties, anywhere from 5 acres to the biggest ones are like 1,200, but mostly between 5 and 40 acres in the Eastern Washington, other places. Sometimes there'll be tree farmers with hundreds. But my job is to be the go-to technical assistance person for particularly wildlife habitat and wildlife questions within that marvelous audience. And so I have the best job I've had my whole career. Been at it 11 years now for DNR, and I've met so many interesting people, yourself included, Matt. And I look down your guest list, and it's like, oh, I know that person, I know that person, I know that person. So I have a wonderful job right now.
Well, good. Yeah, that is one of the unique things I'd say about this industry is the fact that for as big as it is, it's also really, really small. There's not a whole lot of degree of separation between most of us in the industry here in the Pacific Northwest. It doesn't take long that if you're trying to find a way to get a hold of somebody, you either already know them or you only have to know one or two other people to track them down. So what were you kind of doing before? I mean, I've kind of gone through, I know you've got a long career, and what were you doing before you got to DNR, and how'd you get to DNR?
So my pocket biography is I'm actually originally from Virginia, and I went to Virginia Tech and got a forestry degree, fortunately. And I finished in 1979. And I love to say that to these young up and comers. They always sort of smile because they weren't even born, even close to being born yet. And so I migrated to Colorado for a little while, a ski bum, Forest Service seasonal, wound up in Washington in 1986 with a long ago personal complication. But I started to study the spotted owl. So I moved to this place I'd never heard of called Cle Elum, Washington. And my then partner, she was doing the first ever research project on this thing called the spotted owl. I don't even know what that is in Eastern Washington, which led to working for the Forest Service when they were looking for these things. And then I wound up working I went to graduate school, got a master's degree from Ellensburg studying snags and woodpeckers, then went back to the owl and worked for the Yakama Indian Nation for 5 years as a spotted owl biologist. And so, the famous spotted owl, I used to say I was one of the people that actually went out and looked for them. So they weren't mythological creatures. They're this cool deep forest species that lives in the woods. And I actually was a spotted owl biologist for 10 years, essentially. And I've held in my hands over 200 spotted owls.
Wow.
and put bands on them and radios and all that Wild Kingdom kind of stuff. And so did that for a while, which led to a job with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as a habitat biologist reviewing forestry projects in Yakama and Kittitas counties. For 10 years, I was the WDFW TFW biologist, timber, fish, and wildlife in that area. And I got this marvelous exposure to land management. And so I had this kind of revelation about active management on the landscape and working with the owl. I mean, after all the research, all those years, it pretty much boiled down to they're a deep wood species. They got to have a forest at least 100 years old with a bunch of cavities and flying squirrels and all that. And they don't do well in younger forests. And then, all that backstory, and boom, here comes the barred owl. And this is a really interesting historical wrinkle that when I was doing all that owl work in like let me think about this, 86 to 98 with a gap for graduate school. When we first were doing it in 86, 87 to 89, barred owls were really rare. In Eastern Washington, it was unusual to get one. And today, on those same areas, it's all barred owls. The barred owls have won basically on the landscape. So that's a digression. So I started working with these forestry practices and applying my knowledge and experience of wildlife habitat in active forestry settings, doing timber, fish, and wildlife forest practices review. So whenever there would be an ID team, interdisciplinary team, I was always the loyal opposition guy. I'd stand there with my arms crossed, asking for more snags or a bigger stream buffer or whatever. And I learned to work well with the foresters. I have to say, I had a good reputation for being somebody they could work with. But that was that interim phase.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean that's great. And I think that's something maybe folks outside of Washington might not be familiar with, but the TFW process, I know when I started into this industry, it was new to me, but it's interesting. I came into it thinking that was just the way things are done, which, was really,
It's
I
not.
always found it interesting because you had people all with different kind of end goals, but all kind of around the shared idea of how can we still do forest management while complying with all these other needs.
Yes, yes.
And healthy debate rather than just arguing and fighting over stream buffers. Well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Or here's why I can't do that extra here, those type of things. So I always thought that was an interesting process that I think a lot of
Yeah.
the younger foresters, engineers, biologists coming into the industry, at least here in Washington, maybe don't have the benefit and the luxury of being exposed to that right off the bat. So,
Oh, yeah.
so I know it's still there. It's just maybe not quite as successful and widespread part of the culture, I guess, maybe as it was back in the 90s and the late 90s and into the early 2000s. But
Yeah, that's a little bit of a digression, but I will add this point that today now I meet these young people who've, finished school. Let's say I finished at Oregon State University in, 2014 or 2020, got my master's degree, whatever, and they enter into active land management. And what we have in Washington is a well established, mandated set of best management practices. And so when you go out on an interdisciplinary team meeting anymore, no one is saying, I don't think that stream buffer is ecologically adequate, or you're taking away this much of volume. They might say that, but the regulatory people will sit there and listen and they'll go, well, this stream in this type of a setting based on these criteria is a 72-foot buffer with you can thin the outer edge and inner outer, and there is no debate. It's like, this is how we do it. We're going to fix the culvert. We're going to fix the culvert to 1.2 times best or what is it called? Bank full width, and it's going to be bottomless. And now the road engineers are going, oh yeah, this one's going to provide fish passage like this and like this and like this, and it's a remarkable transition. So let's see, may I
Yeah.
continue with the next phase of my story?
Yes, yeah, keep going with your story.
That's a
Definitely.
nice segue. So I actually left forestry for almost 5 years and did salmon recovery. So for 4.5 years, I was the WDFW salmon recovery coordinator, whatever you want to call it, watershed steward in the Upper Columbia. And I went back to forestry when this job came open. So this DNR job has a kind of a unique spin because I like to describe myself as an extension of extension. So our small landowners are a unique client base. 3.2 million acres in the state of Washington is owned by Ken Bevis, Matt Comiskey, Ken Miller, on and on and on, Elaine O'Neill. 3.2 million acres is a lot. It's about roughly half of the private land ownership in the state. It's actually a little bit less, but other private land is Weyerhaeuser, Longview, all on and on. So anyway, our clientele is pretty broad based, and you mentioned that. And so in my job, I work directly with the foresters, the service forestry providers for the DNR, for the conservation districts, for the counties, to try to communicate to people best, not required best management practices, but I always try to take it above and beyond because of this clientele. So pause there and let me elaborate on that in a moment.
Yeah. So I think, maybe that's a good way to kind of get into your current work with the as a stewardship fish and wildlife biologist, but particularly I think, I know a lot of folks, and if we have any listeners out there, that are really probably maybe new to the small forest landowner tree farm arena, understanding how your role, that whole program fits into this whole ecosystem of, DNR, WSU, the conservation districts, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's a very good point. So for the small forest landowners, there is a constellation of resources available, mostly for free. And Matt just mentioned the key purveyors, including your local conservation district. Um, we forgot to mention the NRCS, Natural
Oh,
Resource
yes, yes.
Conservation Service. There's a USDA program, Department of Agriculture, that has grants for small landowners, forestry landowners. The DNR and our services are mostly free, and we also have a significant cost share program now to encourage people uh, in forest health, largely around thinnings in Eastern Washington, but also in Western Washington, helping people with stand conversions and to generate forest health. Um, and the who's the other one? Oh, WSU, Washington State University, is our educational lead for. We have this class called Coached Planning. We do the field days, we do winter school, and I'm their go-to wildlife guy. So, Matt, my joke is that my two strongest things are that I can talk. You want me to talk, I'll talk. I may not know what I'm talking about, but I'll talk. And
Yeah.
the other one is I always show up. And so they say, can you come give a class about? And I say, yes. When is it? Where is it? And what am I supposed to talk about? Sure, I can find out. So I used to be a teacher. I've done a lot of educating. So I'm basically an adult educator. And my thrust is to help people know what's the word? What's the best way to benefit wildlife on their property? So you're nodding, so I'm going to keep
Yeah.
going here.
Yeah. No, no, no. I think that's good. And I think that's so much of the world I operate in is all about forestry and engineering, that kind of stuff. So, hearing more particularly about the wildlife side of it, that kind of it is very helpful and unique. And I guess, as you do that work, and I've been fortunate to see some of those presentations that you've given over the years, including a couple of them. I went through the ag forestry program, and
All
I'm
right.
also on the state's forest health advisory committee. And I think you came and gave a presentation, maybe even played a few songs for the forest health advisory committee early in the start of that work. But
I think I did.
so I mean, what kind of like challenges do you or the department face in doing this work? Because
Yeah.
you know my experience is we have a lot of small forest landowners, like you said, almost half of the land base is small. The ownership, private ownership is small forest
Yeah.
landowners, but a lot of them aren't members of farm forestry.
Oh, no.
A lot of them don't
Oh,
even really know what they have.
very few. Yes.
So I mean, what kind of other challenges other than just getting a hold of them and knocking
Yeah.
them in the head and saying, "Hey, you've got a resource here. You need to
Yeah.
do something with. Whether you want wildlife or you want timber or whatever. If you don't do something, you would run the risk of losing it."
Well, there's 219,000 of these families in the state of Washington. UW did this survey just a couple of years ago. The average age, check this out, Matt. You're young. It's 67.
Oh wow.
The average acreage, 7.2 acres. That's the average. So that's people from their backyard forest. And so the tree farmers, meaning the people with, 300 acres, they're a total minority. Um, and a lot of the people have just bought their 10 acres wherever they're going to build a house. The wildland urban interface continues to expand. People want privacy, they want wildlife habitat. And so a lot of it is basically giving people a handle on the amenity that they're living with. And so a lot of our forestry, what's the word, emphasis on growing timber for harvest is not in their, it's not even in their wheelhouse. And if you run through their objectives, so we always do these values surveys when people take the class. The first value often is privacy. Why do you move out in the woods? You don't want to see your neighbor. The second one is they want to take care of the environment. They want a healthy forest. They want an aesthetic forest, which is interesting. And they want to provide wildlife habitat. Wildlife habitat will be number 3 or number 4. Then harvesting forest products will be down about number 9, 10, or 11 after family values, recreation, just you can kind of imagine. But when somebody has a large enough acreage where they can do some harvest, that'll jump to the top, but it's only at the top for 5 years while they do the harvest. Because, I like to say, all right, here you go, Matt, here's a line for you. You can have this line. Okay. Do you know what forestry's fundamental problem is?
No.
It takes too long. In
Yeah.
Western Washington, one of the best places in the world to grow a tree, if you went from a seedling to a nice, saw dug fir in your best site, that's 35 years. In a normal site, that's 45 to 50 years. How long's your career? 35 to 50 years. That's one tree in one career. And people are impatient. We want things to happen now, 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 now. So oftentimes we're meeting the landowner and you're talking about things that have a decades long effect. So anyway,
Yeah,
okay.
no, that's an interesting observation. Back in the early 2000s, I had a client that I was working for at the time. I had my own consulting business, and we were doing large lot subdivisions in which we are basically creating little mini 20-acre tree farms.
Yeah.
And I wrote about 75 to 85 forest management plans for all those 20-acre mini tree farms.
I bet you I've gone out on some of those.
Yeah, you may have. And what I always thought was interesting was at that time we were getting a lot of people coming out of the King County,
Yeah.
urban Seattle area buying these, and my client would pay for 4 hours of my time to go out and meet with a real estate agent and a prospective buyer. and talk about the forest management plan. And we go through it, and almost every time we get out there and be like, well, I don't want to ever cut these trees. I really want to grow them like a park. What do I do? Does your forest management plan work for that? And I said, well, my forest management plan is written so that you get the tax breaks, which means it's written with the idea of at some point a commercial timber harvest, but you can still take it and tweak it to get, your
Yeah,
land goals and all
that's
that.
right. That's right.
And all of a sudden they'd say, when you say commercial timber harvest, you mean that money, like they're worth something? And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
yeah, any of these that are, about this size and bigger, yeah, they have value. And they're like, how much? I'm like, well, it kind of depends. And they're like, so this is kind of like money in the bank if I need it for my grandkid to go to college.
Hey,
It was amazing the number of people that I would run into that never wanted to cut a tree till they found out there was a dollar value attached to
significant
it.
dollar too.
And then all of a sudden, the chainsaws were running. So it is interesting how that priority, ranking that you talked about can suddenly shift when, some things pop out like that. But
And one of the rubrics of the aesthetic over time, when you say timber harvest, people automatically think about clear cuts. And they generally don't really like clear cuts. They're so harsh and everything, unless you have a background in forestry. But there are many cases where you can do a commercial thinning and you still have a forest and it looks like a forest. You can cut half the trees and it's still a forest in their eyes.
oh yeah,
And you'll still have the forest based wildlife. So that's it. Yeah. And okay. Well, so um, here's something. Okay. I'm going to add this too. Now, I have enough time in forested settings and with a background in forestry, I've developed an eye for stand dynamics. And so I will say to people, you walk into any given stand, and I like to remind them of how it got there. What was the land use history leading to what we're looking at right now? And the natural forest of Washington is disturbance based. So over history long ago, and I always start my classes with this, as I say, oh, the land was once covered with a quote mighty forest, and it varied all over the place. But let's say in Western Washington, it was largely big trees in this variable canopy with big gaps in it, and all this, and the natural quote natural I don't like that word, the baseline fauna that was in the old forest that we really started harvesting about 1890, 1900. So somewhere between 1880 and 1925, we logged off almost all of Western Washington with some exceptions. But that may, okay, so let's say even 1925. So my small forest landowner, we're looking at a stand that was cut in, 1900 to 1920. It was cut again in 1975 or 1980. And now what we're looking at is 40 years of regrowth. Or it was just cut 5 years ago and we're looking at young stand of brush. And anyway, I'll say, so that natural forest that was disturbance based, it would either get wind throw, a fire, a flood, something like that. There was gaps, there was canopy. But what was in that forest that's missing in these new iterations is the big dead wood, which is why I emphasize snags and down logs, because the legacy features of those natural disturbance events are something we've removed with our land management. And so as people want to have wildlife, then I'm always emphasizing these natural features that are often big trees or big dead trees. And that's sort of this really interesting like twist in the head. And I even did, I mentioned this, but I did a master's degree on snags woodpeckers because I was so interested in the deadwood component. And so I'm always trying to remind people to include elements that would mimic natural disturbance while you're doing your activity. So Matt, I'm the longest running instructor in the Washington Contract Loggers Association certification training. Jerry Bonagovsky is a friend, and I've been doing WCLA for like 24 years. I did it all the way through doing my salmon job, and Jerry just brings me back, and so essentially that notion of reminding people of disturbance is significant for providing habitat complexity on your property. Did that make
Yeah, no,
sense?
that's and a lot of times in my world, it's the figuring out how do we leave the snags without the risk of killing somebody by leaving it there because we're harvesting around it. But
Great.
that's that is a very key point, I'd say. It is figuring out where how to leave that complexity, how to create that complexity, or even where are the best places on the landscape for it?
Maintain it. Well, here's one. This has been a major shift, and I know you know this, and many of the listeners will too. But most logging these days is fully mechanical, and
Yes.
so it's not Ken and Matt with chainsaws, and we're still sometimes. I mean, the hand falling and everything, but those big machines, the big snipper machines, they can make a snag in 14 seconds, and I always advocate for if there's butt defect, snip it off. Just reach up there and make an 8-foot stub. And you see these around. You see these around in units across the state. There'll be, oh, look at that. Why? And they did that because they're creating some habitat complexity. It's not required in the rules. I wish it was, but snip them off where you can. Or if you have a situation where you have a hazard tree, like in a residential setting, because a lot of times these people with the 5 acres, they build a house. We go visit, myself and the forester, and we can look at all the stuff. We tell them what kind of trees there are. But the real question is that tree going to fall on my house?
Yep. Yep.
They're worried about hazard. And it's like, you know what? If have an arborist look at it, and if you're really worried about it, have the arborist go up 30 feet, jag it off with a chainsaw, basically top it in, turn it into a stub, and then it'll rot in place. It's not going to fall on anything. There's no weight up at the top. And the woodpeckers and the owls and everything will live in it. It'll be a great habitat feature. So I like to call that hazard to habitat. And
Yeah, that's a good. I can see that across a T-shirt someplace.
I
Hazard to
could, yeah, yeah,
habitat,
yeah.
or a
Yeah.
tagline for an arborist. But that's an interesting idea. So, do you actually like kind of recommend? Because most man-made snags I've seen are just
They're
like you said,
flat.
that flat. Somebody. So, do you actually recommend kind of
Yeah.
roughing up the top with the saw so it can
Yes.
kind of grab moisture and stuff and provide spot for the bugs, which
Yes.
then
Three things. There's more surface area, so fungal spores and bugs and things. It'll collect pine needles and things. And actually, birds can't really perch. Think about the way a bird's, like a songbird's feet work. They can't really grab something flat very easily. So if you don't even have to jag it up very much. Do a Bart Simpson to it. I actually took the International Society of Arborists wildlife tree creation class twice, and helped instruct one time. But they have this great ISA has this great little program on this very topic and they get way down in the weeds about what kind of saw cut at an angle, yada yada, put a cavity in it. It's like, holy smokes, those guys are artists. Arborists are a really interesting breed of cat, men and women. Anyway, so yeah, I totally advocate for that, because it's an opportunity on the landscape. And the fact is, as our developed footprint expands, I mean, every single road, every single home site, every single log landing is a safety zone where we have to remove those structures. And so anyway, I mean, you maintain where you can. And one problem with the mechanical, excuse me, what do you call it? The mechanical logging these days is they whole tree yard, and then the top goes in that big pile instead of staying out there on the landscape. And every now and then somebody will take the tong and drag them back out there, but that's a whole extra step. And I totally understand efficiency. So anyway, yeah, I
yeah.
advocate for maintaining broken dead wood, creating it even as a way of mimicking natural disturbance, which will provide the greatest opportunities for the fauna to persist. And we're not talking about deer and elk and bears, even. We're talking about salamanders, flying squirrels, woodpeckers, the little stuff that is so foundational to the forest. And a lot of it lives like down under the brush under the log. I'm waving my arms around here. I get
Or
excited about
yeah,
this.
no. That's great. I mean, I think it was, last January, January 24 over there for the Board of Natural Resources retreat. And, looking at some of the stuff that State Lands is doing in some of the lynx habitat,
Oh yeah.
trying to create more habitat for bunnies rather than, kind of
Right.
the old species recovery model. If we draw a big box around it and walk
Right.
away and hope that Mother Nature takes care of it,
Right.
it's like, well, we've, for centuries we've been managing these lands, humans have been one way or another. So we probably can also continue to find ways to manage it and do better. And it was really interesting looking at some of the stuff that they were doing, and hearing about how, close your ears if you've got young kids, but all the lynx food that they're growing by making lots of little bunnies, and seeing the poor little radio collars with the lynx teeth marks in it, going, oh well, that was a
Oh.
little bunny. But
Nature
it's just
read into
it
the
really
thought.
is interesting. And you're right. I think that large scale production forestry, I think, sometimes makes challenges of creating some of that
Yeah.
habitat. But being able to get out there, and I think Eastern Washington, I feel like it's more, because of the fuel loading and stuff, people tend to want to drag that stuff back out into the woods.
Yes.
But
Or
yeah,
burn it.
creating any of those little brush piles, those types of things. I've got a few around my place, and yeah, you tend to find a lot of little bunnies and birds and all sorts of things
Oh,
in there.
entirely.
So,
I call them habitat piles. Okay, so Matt, there's three kinds of piles. Okay, ready? There's a
yep.
slash pile, which is unconsolidated logging material that usually you burn, but sometimes they're huge. There's a brush pile, which is where you put stuff you're going to get rid of. And oftentimes the brush pile stays there. And there's a habitat pile, which is deliberately constructed and maintained for the birds and the chipmunks and the bunnies and everything. And a habitat pile, the difference is that it's constructed to a spec where you put the big stuff on the bottom and you make it hollow. And it's such an opportunity. And you don't have to leave every single one of them, but it's a total opportunity to make a nice habitat feature. So thank you for leaving some behind. And I've been harping on that. So one thing I get to do in this job is write for forest stewardship notes. This is the WSU and one DNR too, our small forest landowner news. So I write these articles about these topics like habitat piles or snags or whatever, and you can search them. If you search habitat pile, that article will pop up. It's so interesting. So I get to be like a technical service provider even when I'm not talking directly to the person. It's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
well, I mean, in today's technological age, I mean, there's one of you, and I know that your other colleagues at DNR and WSU Extension stuff. There's not a lot of you, especially when you compare you to the number of landowners out there who either need your help or don't know that they need your help.
Yeah.
And so yeah,
they,
having
they don't
those.
know. I hope they're listening. Call me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well,
Well,
and part of my job too is to train the foresters to say, for example, oh, that snag's not a hazard. That's a good habitat feature. Like there's been some significant changes in the awareness in forestry over the past few years. And I like to ask this question. I'll be with a group of foresters and I'll say, how many of you know, and I'll ask this to the audience, how many of you know that a standing dead tree is a valuable habitat feature for wildlife? And virtually everybody will say yes. It wasn't many years ago where they'd say, I thought that was a waste and it was ugly and we got to get rid of it. But now that doesn't mean you won't necessarily cut it down or it's in the way or something, but we do know its value. So
yeah,
anyway,
no,
yeah,
I mean, I remember being actually on a field trip a number of years ago on the Olympic National Forest, and we had a group of folks, some from industry and some from the other side of the fence, I guess you'd say. And they saw this big tree out in the stand we had walked out into, and they're like, "Oh, I bet you guys just want that on the back of a log truck to get to your mill right away." And one of the log buyers standing there said, "Actually, no, that tree's more valuable standing." And there was just like
Hmm.
this bewildered look, and they're like, "What do you mean?" And he walked him through the whole thing of, well, if you look around the base, there's some evidence of some kind of rot going on here, because there was like some obviously fruiting bodies of some kind of fungus starting to show up, and it had like three tops up there at 45 feet, and some big ugly limbs here and there. And he's like, this thing's on its way to becoming the perfect wildlife tree.
Wow.
And
And the industry guy knew that. There you
oh
go.
yeah, and and we're like, yeah,
Great.
so out of that total tree, maybe we've got one 24-foot log and one 36-foot log, and because it had multiple tops. And we were like, but the rest of it, if it gets cut, it's just going to be
Nice.
laying there in the slash pile. It's green, so we can leave it.
Nice.
It's not a snag safety
Yeah.
hazard. So that one's better. I'd rather have three of those other ones over there that you didn't even notice that I would like it, but would make a much better saw log. And that other one's going to make a much better wildlife tree.
Well, and that this segues a little bit too, because I like to call myself a reformed tree hugger. So back in the day when I was doing owl work, I was like, oh my God, logging is the worst thing. Oh, look at those. Oh, and I was like so green. It was like, I'm almost embarrassed. And I've come a long ways because I acknowledge now, excuse me, the necessity of active management on the landscape for multiple objectives. And the beauty of forestry, no kidding, is it takes so long, but that's also an opportunity. I said it's a problem, but it's an opportunity because while you're growing your trees, natural processes can happen. And a lot of the public benefits from forest can happen in actively managed forests. Water quality, a tree plantation gives you good water quality. We can have good wildlife habitat, better wildlife habitat with certain practices, thinnings on and on. And so the way I think a really important way forward in this next era with the warming climate, yada, yada, 8.5 billion people on and on, is we have to figure out ways to maintain the biodiversity and the ecosystem services in the active landscape. And like what you said, put a big box around it and say, okay, that's where wildlife is. That's a preserve of some kind. Well, that's important too. That's not to say those aren't important, but holy smokes, we've got to work on the rest of the landscape. So how do you do that? And that's actually become kind of my whole focus, is to generate actionable items to get there. So I like to make the joke that I only teach one class. It's the same one over and over, and it goes like this: these are the kind of animals that live in the kind of habitat that you're in, and this is how the things you're going to do will affect them. And you can do that same talk for kindergartners or the Board of Natural Resources, but you just twist it around a little bit and emphasize particular things. And that actionable item is what I call them my landowners, but I'm feeling sort of possessive. It's like,
Well, I understand why you feel possessive.
yeah,
I mean, there's companies I've worked for that, I haven't been back out on those properties, but when I look at them, and especially the ones where I know that I laid out that harvest system and that road, that's my road.
it's my road.
That's my harvest unit, and I think that's an interesting thing that just kind of popped into my head was with our very mobile society today, I feel like it's almost kind of unique because forestry is such a long-term
Yes,
process.
yes.
I was taught early in my career, you go back right after the road's built, you go back right after the unit's logged, you look at what you did right, what you did wrong, you go back 5 years later if you have the opportunity. And I guess for me, I like to still try to go back to
Yeah.
harvest units I laid out 20, 25 years ago and go see. And, there's oh, hey, I did that right. Oh, that didn't turn out how I thought it would be. But, I've also spent enough time with wildlife biologists and fisheries and geologists and stuff that, you know, I, I wonder what our next generation of foresters that might be more mobile and more specialized will be dealing with, because
Well
I know
said.
for me, having been trained by, or having the input of different ologists, whether geologists, biologists, fisheries folks, over my career has really shaped, the type of work I do, the lookout, that kind of thing, and all of that. So, he's grabbing his guitar.
Well, here's one too. Wanted to make sure I threw this in that forestry. Okay, given the chaos in the world, and a lot of people are really bummed out about this, that, or the other. But if you work in forestry, you're optimistic. You're planting trees. That's that old thing about why, you plant a tree so that someone can sit in its shade in the future or harvest it in the future. So we have a certain amount of faith in our future in working in forestry and wildlife and fisheries. And in the state of Washington, I think it's really interesting that we are doing a lot of stuff for the future. That's right.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, before we get to your music, though, I know you live in a fire-prone part of the state. How's that impacted your work?
I live in the Methow Valley, halfway between Twisp and Winthrop. And in 2014, when the Carlton complex was rocking, a fire started a mile from our house, burned up. Our house almost burned down. The firefighters, local volunteer firefighters saved our house because we had a good ingress and egress, and I had done enough defensible space. We had green space, yada, yada. And I gave a presentation I wrote an article and did a presentation called My House Almost Burned Down, that at the time got more hits than anything in the history of that newsletter. So it really changed my mind about the difference between fuel and habitat. If it's close to your house, it's fuel, because you don't want to lose your house. You don't want people's houses burning down. So living in a fire prone landscape and having witnessed since we've been here, we've had 3 direct fire threats on our property. And we're sort of in the savanna edge of the Ponderosa Pine. And the property that my wife and I bought, we have 15 acres with a house in the middle of it. And the fire killed virtually all of my trees. I mean, almost all of them. So, Matt, in a marvelous irony, the snag guy owns a snag patch. Um, yeah, and the bird life actually changed quite a bit. Before the fire, we had these nice open grown pine trees. Now they've busted off. They've got a flicker cavity in them, yada yada. So it's really shifted the way I view stand dynamics in a fire landscape. And so I think having direct experience with it just amped it up. I mean, you can read things, go visit fires, but it was terrifying. I mean, it was, there's still a little PTSD from it. Um, but living in this landscape and reading about, historical fires and all of those things, it shaped the way that I approach wildlife habitat in dry forest in particular, because you can have good wildlife habitat with much lower stocking than nature has put us in. And the whole thing with the 15 to 25 year fire intervals, the stand was, 35 trees per acre, but they were 4 feet in diameter, da da da. Wait 100 years, fill it in with grand fir, and you have 500 stems per acre. You really need to do something. You can't just burn it. You can't just set it on fire, because you'll lose those big trees. So the notion of active management shaping your habitat. Now, I have to add this too, that we often will park out these stands. We'll be very aggressive in simplifying them over really big areas. And so I advocate for habitat complexity using commercial slops, snags, logs, legacy, openings, patches, piles, and shrubs, slops. Um, we even made a brochure. So look up slops, which is kind of a toolbox. So 10% of the unit in some kind of habitat complexity, do it on purpose. And so when people say like, well, I want to reduce fire risk and have a healthier forest, but I want wildlife. So I'll say, how do I do that? So that's actually probably my best example of actionable items to that objective. So some slops.
Yeah. Well, I would definitely recommend anybody watching this to go Google and find your article on titled "My House Almost Burned Down."
Oh,
And I really would encourage people particularly to go over and try to tour some of the open areas, particularly on our federal lands that are in the footprint of the Carlton complex and some of the other fires. I've unfortunately had the pleasure of walking a lot of the Carlton complex on DNR state trust lands. And yeah, it actually almost starts to make you angry when you see how much is burned up and how
it's
much
true.
we've lost because you do. I mean, you a lot of these I've been in fires before and stuff, but I've never been to where I've seen 40, 50, 70-year-old trees with no limbs left because the fire was so intense it burned everything but the bole of the tree.
Yeah,
And that ends up changing the landscape and the habitat not for years but for decades.
that's right. We
And
don't want
and
to, we
then
don't,
just
yeah,
yeah, and then just all of the other impacts that it has on the humans that are living in that environment as well. So,
yeah.
um,
Well, and we've done some, I will give my agency kudos in regard to community outreach and really good fuels reduction projects in the built environment. Uh, Kitatas around Cleellum, they're just doing fantastic work up here to a certain extent. But yeah, we've done some really, really good work. But at the same time, you can include wildlife habitat. And like you said, Matt, when the stands have gotten so dense in the absence of that historical ecological fire, sure enough, and with super hot, dry summers, you have this perfect storm, so to speak, of hot, dry, too much fuel. You throw a little wind behind it, like Carlton. The Carlton fire at the time was the biggest fire in the history of Washington, 250,000 acres. The following year, there was the Okanagan fire, 300,000 acres, and they've just continued. And so I had this sort of hope back in the day that wow, boy, we were the big fire. No, there's been one after another. So it's just it's the way that it works now. And any place where we can reduce the fuel loading while maintaining wildlife habitat, snags, logs, legacy openings, patches, piles, and shrubs, uh, we won't lose the green stand. We'll have one left over. And then you'll see places where the density was less, in some natural settings, and there was good fire. Like you'll hear the fire ecologists now talk about good fire and bad fire, and some of these big fire events, there'll be areas where it's like, well, it did pretty well right there, but over there, no. So
yeah.
it's yeah, and Western Washington is different. It's a very different beast. But let's not go there. You can get another guest to talk about Western
Yeah, in the
Washington
Western
fire.
Washington, our whole fire regime over here actually makes it kind of scary for the density of the population that we have. So,
And you're
but
not
since
and you're not fuel limited.
exactly, yes. And a lot of people sometimes forget that a lot of our very large fires were east wind in a warm drought period
Yep.
driven late in the year.
Yep.
So yeah, it's something we need to be careful of, keep an eye on. So tell us a little bit more about your music and how it's helped you in your work at DNR.
Well, let's see. So I'm a singer-songwriter and have been for a long time. And I actually write poetry, believe it or not, but songs are poetry. Like I said, I can talk. I think I can write. I don't know. I do. And so I created this, or no, I still do it. I'm working on a body of songs about nature. and I will give a presentation and throw a song in the middle of it. So, like the bear song. Can you hear that?
Yes. Yep. A little bit. Yeah. Oh, it went away.
So go to YouTube and Google my name and YouTube, and up will pop the True Bear video that my friend Dave New, tree farmer, took bear pictures and videos from his property and made a music video with my song behind it. I've played the song literally sitting on a bridge at his property, and it's really fun. So my music is essentially a way of reaching the other side of people's brains. It's so interesting because what people will remember, okay, I'll do a class and I'll play the bear song or the woodpecker song. Um, and they'll say, oh, you're that guy that sang the animal song. That's what they remember. And so it's helped in my work, I think, just by virtue of a flourish, if you want to call it that. It's sort of like uh, a good photography. Like think back on a presentation you saw where you remember certain images, but you can't remember what the talk was about. Oh, that was that Matt guy. He had the cool picture of the foggy forest. What did he talk about? I don't know, trees, something. Right. Anyway, so my music has been a way to do that. I have a website. Oh, you get to pitch that, right, Matt?
Yeah, no. You can pitch it, all that kind of stuff. Before we go there, though, so I'm going to do that as kind of the wrap up, so we
Oh,
make
good.
sure we get everything. But we are kind of getting. I don't want to keep you here all day. I mean, you probably got to tune up your skis to go skiing tomorrow, right? Um, but is as you're kind of nearing the end of your career, though, I'm guessing what I know of you, that's not really gonna, you'll just transition into a different form of your career. But for a new forester or a new wildlife biologist out there, what's kind of one piece of advice that
Ooh,
you would give them?
that's a good one. When people ask me for input like that, I'll say, "Well, do you want to hear from Uncle Ken?" It's sort of like put on your old guy hat because I hate to say this, but I'm a senior citizen now. It's like I don't know how that happened. A young guy like you, Matt, it'll happen to you too, and you won't
Oh,
understand.
I'm much closer to it than you probably would guess. So,
All right. Well, anyway, I will say get some education, get some kind of a credential. 2 years, fine, but get that and get some experience in the field. In the first part of your career, get out in the field. And I don't care what you do. You could lay out roads, you could survey for fish, you could go do trail maintenance, you could fight fires, but get in the field, go there. And when you do that, you're going to start to build your network. And Matt, we were talking about this earlier, that your network is what will ultimately get you your next job, or um, or will what's the word, carry you forward. And you're going to use it your whole life. And so you get experience, education experience, same time, network, and do a good job. So when you get a job, okay, you got to do three things. You have to be reliable, you have to be competent. You don't have to be a superstar. You just have to be competent, and you have to be easy to get along with. And if you do those three things, then you'll get a good referral, and your network will get you the next job. And then your career always needs to be moving forward. It's going to have a bunch of little starts and stops, and I'm drawing this like convoluted line. But as long as you're going forward, then that's fine. Even if you totally switch career tracks, I decided to open a restaurant. If that's an even line, and there you go. So there you go. So get some experience and build that network because it's just the best thing.
that is actually probably some of the best advice I've had anybody share, probably throughout my entire career, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just because as I'm getting, it's hard to believe when I think back to it that I've been in this for almost 30 years.
What?
Yeah, yeah, 1990, I graduated from the UW in 1991. Um,
And
so
okay, 91. So the owl was just hitting the fan.
Oh, yep, yeah. I was at the UW to witness a lot of the debates between Chad Oliver and Jerry Franklin.
Nice. I've met both of them. I've had the pleasure of meeting both of those guys. Have you had Jerry on your show yet, or
I
Chad?
have not had Jerry on my show. I actually took forest stand dynamics from Chad.
You should get both of those guys. That would be really interesting. I
Yeah,
think,
I will give it a shot, see what I can do. Yeah,
but okay, but you were there, yeah, because for the audience, there was a significant debate at UW of different approaches to forestry, and you were there, Matt.
oh yeah, I was there and there when, the forest management program lost a lot of its outside funding from industry. The forest engineering program, which is where I ended up, and pulp and paper, we still had a lot of, the forest management folks had to come over to use our computers because industry was still supporting kind of, that side of the school
Wow,
and all of that. But, yeah, I learned a lot about my forestry from Chad Oliver, and I don't know, his stand dynamics book just kind of clicked with me and made a lot of sense. So,
nice. I've read that one.
especially I think gets what I really appreciated about Chad's work then was it kind of gets to that comment you made earlier of really having to go back and look at the history of the land, and understand what happened 5, 10, 20, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago to get you to where what you're seeing today.
Yeah, how did you
Um,
get here, and where do you want it to go?
right, exactly. And then that can help inform based on your goals, needs, desires, regulations,
Yep.
how you get to that future stand that you want to create. So, um, but hey, this has been fun. If I know myself, I could go on talking to you for several more hours.
But you get back up here to Twist, and we'll go back down to the barbecue place.
Yes, well, that was a very good barbecue place, though. I don't know. I might have to drag my wife along this time. That was a business trip for me. We were actually looking at a forest health treatment on the Forest Service. Is why I
Oh,
was over there. That's a whole other topic and whole other show for how that whole thing played
well,
out. But
you better get a snowmobile if you're going to try to go there now, because there's 2 feet of snow.
yeah, no, no, we're
Well,
budget
so
problems. The Forest Service doesn't have the money to do the project now. So, but that's the short story.
we digress.
Yes,
Well,
but
okay. Did we cover all the topics you were
I
looking
I think
towards?
we did, and unless there's anything else you want to add, but how do people get a hold of you both professionally and then
Oh, thank
personally
you.
if they're interested in your music? Or I think you even do some shows from time to time. I
I
think
do.
when I saw you, you were either had just come or you were headed down to Mount Adams Resource
All
Stewardge
right.
to do some music for Jay down there. So
Yep. So
um
I did a we called it Songs of Nature, and it was a community forestry event. They got up there and talked about their work. Mount Adams Resource Stewards, DNR pitched their stuff, and then I did a set of songs with a friend who plays keyboards down there. So yes, I do shows. I'm hoping to do more of that when I retire, or after I retire. I'd love to take it on the road. I've done school assemblies. I've played at pubs. Um, so it's really fun, and I have this body of work about nature songs, and so I have a website. It's called cleverly kenbevis.com, one word, and so
okay.
you can hear my songs there. Um, and there's also a contact link in there, one of those little email things. I've
Mm-hmm.
had the website for a couple of years. It's really, it's been interesting, Matt, is I have not made any money off of it. Um, but people can hear my stuff and they can reach out to me that. And then for my work, it's ken.bevis at dnr.gov. You can find me through the small landowner service portal on Washington DNR's website. We actually have a pretty good methodology for finding your local service forester. So the way that we're set up is locally, you'll have the service forester who is kind of your lead point of contact, and then they can help you find for example, the Family Forest Fish Passage Program or riparian easement, or to have the regulatory assistance people help you with a proposed harvest. If you're writing a stewardship plan, you might have me help you with the stewardship plan, but you can use that DNR small landowner portal to find your service forester, and I'm listed on there too.
Okay. Yeah, no, I actually I will sing DNR's praises in that I think that the creation of that new portal has been really, I think, kind of a game changer for, how those of us outside of the agency recommend and give, advice for how small forest landowners can connect with all the resources out there. So
Oh, it's so true. It is so true because we honestly, I've worked for government for a long time, and our program is probably the most service oriented and effective that I've ever been around. The DNR, and I'm lauding my agency, is very effective. We get stuff done.
oh
You know,
yeah, no, definitely.
we
And
do. We get stuff done, and we've got so many guidelines that we're not flaky. We're effective. It's like boom. So
yep. We just have to make sure that those folks that sit over in Olympia keep funding you guys so that you got all the resources you need to get out there to do the good work that you do.
exactly. Well, there's one of me, and probably my greatest strength is I've been at this sort of stuff for 80 in Washington since 1986. So how many decades is that's almost 40 years, and I get around, so to speak, and I know a lot of people, including Matt now, by golly. And
Yeah.
so I always say to people, use me. I'm not going anywhere. Even after I retire, I'll still be in the game. And I'd be happy to come sing for you, whoever it is.
Alrighty. And I would really encourage anybody that's out there has an opportunity to reach out to you and invite you to come sing for their event because I've been in the audience and it is a fun time.
Nice.
You do a really good job, and so I will make sure I put all the contact information there in the show
Oh,
notes
please.
for this. And thank you very much, and it's been fun chatting with you.
Yes. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed this, and appreciate your good work. So,
Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
all righty. You too. Bye.